Storey Time with Stephanie Storey.
Hi, I am Stephanie Storey, historical novelist, and this is Story Time. My guest today is the author of the wildly popular The Forgotten Hours, as well as her latest, which was just out on March 1st, This Terrible Beauty. And I've been lucky enough to meet this brilliant woman at a couple of speaking events where we were both speaking on the same stage. But I have not had a chance to sit down and have an actual really good one-on-one conversation with her. So I'm very excited that she's here today. Welcome to the show, Katrin Schumann.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Stephanie, and congratulations to you on your new book.
It's crazy.
Yes, I know. I see it there behind you. It's so beautiful. You know, I think we both are lucky. We have gorgeous covers, but isn't it terrible not to be able to get out there and actually talk about our books?
Okay, I was not going to start there, but now I am. We both had a book come out within the month of the pandemic hitting.
Yeah.
That has been rough for me. I know I had a day when I wept. I know I just had a day when I crumbled. Now I've launched a talk show. Apparently that's what it's done to me. I don't know.
Well, there you go. You never know what's going to happen, right?
How have you handled it? How have you dealt with it?
Yeah.
Emotionally and physically?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like in a way I was really lucky because my book came out March 1st. And so I managed to sneak in under the wire one book launch here in Key West. I'm currently in Key West. And then I did one book launch with my whole writers community, which was really fantastic. And lots of people came on March 4th. And then literally right after that, things started to slow down. And that was it. I mean, that was my last chance to talk about the book in person, with a live audience. And it's interesting, because I'm kind of introverted, but writing books and having your book come out gives the opportunity for somebody like me to really be totally in my own world and talk as much as I want to about the thing that I want to talk about. It's like a license to just jabber. And so I miss that. I feel that person to person energy that comes when you publish a book and get to promote it in bookstores and at events and so on. There's something really magical about that, really exciting about that. You must feel similar.
Yeah, there's something amazing about that connection with your reader and being able to talk openly about what you're doing and just hear what the readers have to say, and that back and forth and that connection. So that's that's the part of it that I miss is being able to actually hear from readers and sit in the same room. As I mentioned at the top, I've launched a talk show. You have been doing 5-page critiques of students. Is that?
Yeah.
Tell us why you're doing that. Is that part of the coping mechanism?
Yeah, it is. And it's been so great. It really has been amazing. So a couple of years ago, when I got my deal for The Forgotten Hours, the book that came out last year, I stopped doing all the teaching, basically, and I really stopped doing my consulting work. I had done coaching and editing and, was really involved through Grub Street, which is a writing center in Boston. I was really involved there in doing a lot of, teaching and working with new writers. And my husband and I moved to Key West, and I took on the role as the program coordinator for the Key West Literary Seminar, which is a small nonprofit. And I run their workshop program and their scholarships. But as a consequence, I was doing no coaching and no teaching. I had plenty on my plate, doing this brand new job, which was new to me. And then also having 2 books come out in such quick succession. And so I realized in a conversation with my husband right when this whole thing broke, and an addendum is that I'm having a lot of trouble working on my next novel. So I was kind of miserable because I was like, here we are, we're all at home. We're supposed to be writing away, being amazingly productive because we're not doing anything else. And when I realized that was really going to be hard for me, my husband and I had this discussion. He was like, well, you loved teaching and you loved coaching. I just really like helping other writers. And so I had the idea of doing the 5 free pages. And my only concern was that I would be absolutely inundated and it would be just crazy. But actually it's been amazing. I've done a few dozen and they kind of come in each day they come in and everybody's incredibly grateful. And I just tell them it's going to take me a week or more. And I like it. I really like it. It makes me feel useful and I'm happy. It's like I'm volunteering or something, it feels good because it's hard for people to get honest feedback from a professional about their work. You either have to pay a lot for it, in which case you're normally engaging in some massive edit that's going to cost you, hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars, or you're asking a friend to read your book and, you're not really sure, is their advice spot on or do they have that kind of professional viewpoint? So I think it's something that really is helpful and that just makes me feel good.
Now, you said at the beginning of that part that you're struggling with creativity, with actually writing your next novel. I think there's so many people, I see that all over my social media. I'm hearing that from so many of their friends. They're beating themselves up too for not
it's
being
horrible.
productive during this moment.
Yeah.
Is that outreach to other people calming some of that? Is it inspiring you? Are you still not back to it? Where are you in that personal?
Well, I think it's doing all those things. It's calming me. It's giving me something to do where even if I can't work on my book, at least I feel like I've done something. And it's sort of giving me ideas. I mean, it's really nice to be connected again with new writers and to realize that I need to calm down and that editor on my shoulder who's telling me that every idea I have is dumb because what book, makes any sense in this day and age, it reminds me just to sort of chill out a little bit about that. But that's not to say I'm writing. I'm getting there. I'm working toward it.
Okay, your first two books, to my mind, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but your first two books to me are both about one sort of overcoming a global trauma. This new one that's out, and we'll get to it a little bit more. This Terrible Beauty is about overcoming World War II and sort of a trauma that happens to a world as we're going through right now. The other one feels more like overcoming the trauma of a personal trauma.
Yeah.
This is obviously going to be a moment where we as a culture are going to have to rebuild from that. One, is this first, and then I'll get to the second half. First, is this pandemic changing the way you're thinking about writing about those things, if you're still planning on writing about those kinds of rebuilding moments for people?
I think that I can't help but write about that as a main theme. Essentially sort of what happens to the individual when life deals you a hand, that you weren't expecting. I mean, on a very basic level, that's what happens in my books, with kind of in different environments and different scales. As you say, with the first one, it was much more family oriented and sort of smaller scale. And with the second one, it's kind of, global because it's set during the Cold War. And I think that preoccupation is going to stick with me. I just, all writers have various personal challenges. And my challenge always is in my first draft, which is always that, proverbial shitty first draft, just like our dear friend Anne Lamott said. It's just hard for me to believe in it when it's still so rough. And I second guess the ideas behind it. Like, why does anybody care about this? Why is this important? And on the other hand, another voice in my head says, just give it time. It'll come together. You'll build this world. You'll be telling the story. You're just getting started. Of course it doesn't look yet like a beautiful sculpture, that you spent years crafting. You're just still playing with clay. It's still just like, lumpy. But so I think that's where I have the issue, is that I'm kind of a perfectionist, and yet you cannot be a perfectionist when you start first drafts. So I'm sure my books will continue to be around similar topics of the, the individual, and usually it's women, sort of rising to the occasion or making bad choices based on what's happening around them. I'll probably continue working on that kind of stuff.
So what are you learning during this moment, or what has writing about this for as long as you have and focusing on this, what has it taught you about how we can all recover from this and not make bad choices? Do you have any particular
Oh gosh, I sure wish I knew. You know, I don't know that I have any particular lessons on that to share. I mean, I can say that personally, I like to keep busy. I like to, you know, have a kind of a routine. Now, what becomes hard is that that routine usually in my normal life is broken up by all sorts of excitement, right? So I'll be going on book tour, I'll be flying somewhere to talk to some people, or I'll be, you know, meeting somebody exciting or teaching somewhere or whatever. And now my routine is not broken up by those things anymore. So, but, you know, for me, it's all about creating a little bit of a normalization of the everyday that I can live with, you know. So for me, the big excitement was going to Home Depot with my mask on. And, you know, here it's not critical here right now in Key West. If I were in New York City, I would not be doing that. But, you know, I can still go out a little bit here and there, and that's like the highlight of my day.
Do you know where I don't know if I want to call it obsession, but your focus on this women recovering from trauma and from setback, do you know where that came from in you? Have you ever thought about it?
Yeah, I have thought about that since my books are so different in a way. Like, since when you look at them from the outside, you think, you know, the same person wrote that.
Yeah.
They're set in such different eras, and they really, so I thought a lot about what connects them and how did I come to be the person who wrote these two books. And I think it has to do with the fact that I was always an outsider everywhere that I lived in my life. I was born in Germany, moved to New York when I was little, then moved to London as a teenager. And I was always somebody who didn't really fit in and would sort of observe how other people behaved. And I had quite strict German parents. But I was very stubborn. And so we clashed massively. So I think I myself am torn between being the good girl, like who does who does everything she's supposed to do, and, you know, professionally, I'm always on time. I'm, you know, I really am self-controlled about those kinds of things, and yet there's a wild side to me. And I think that that's what I'm interested in, like exploring, sort of putting myself into these different situations and saying, what would somebody who has the same sort of curiosity and the same moral drive that I have, but maybe make some wrong choices, what would that person do? I think it's a little bit to do with that outsider status that I've always felt.
It's so interesting because I love that you were born in Germany and that you lived in London and Brooklyn, and now you split your time between Boston and Key West. Like, I do feel
Yeah.
like you have all of these different perspectives on the world and life. What kind of other than giving you this outsider feeling, do you feel like it's given you a positive, different perspective on the world that serves your writing in some way?
Yeah, I do actually. Well, one thing is, I think that I am by nature really very empathetic. And I think that I am not quick to form judgments about people because I myself was often misjudged as a teenager. You know, I know that we all come across in a certain way. And I always came across as very I was quiet, right? But people misinterpreted that. They thought it was because I had airs and I thought I was so fancy, you know? So I think that my not fitting in and my struggling to fit in and my being an outsider and being different means that I'm hugely empathetic to people. That doesn't mean that I think everything's okay. I mean, I have a very strong sense of loyalty and honesty. And, you know, there are things that are core values that I hold very tightly. But I also can see where people struggle. You know, I understand the struggle. And I think I just see more clearly than many that there are nuances and gray areas, and that's what I'm really interested in. When push comes to shove and we're living in that gray zone and it's not so obvious what's the right thing to do, what happens in that moment?
So you mentioned earlier that your two books they look on the surface like they're very different.
Yeah.
One is The Forgotten Hours. It appears to be much more contemporary, and then This Terrible Beauty is historical. It's after World War II, and as you to your point, the Cold War. And which one do you like better of those two fiction elements? Do you like the contemporary stuff or the historical stuff better, and why?
Well, I think that I gravitate toward the historical naturally. My interests lie, like the next novel I'm working on is going to be set in the 1960s.
Okay.
I think, the Forgotten Hours, which was published first, that is a very contemporary story. It's basically sort of a Me Too story. And that was a really hard book to write. I really didn't want to write that book. And I struggled all the way through it. And it was really, basically, it was written because there was no other way for me to work through the ideas that I was struggling with that book is centered on. The only way I knew how to do that was by creating this big fictional story around this dilemma, this idea of how well do we really know anybody. So it's a story in a nutshell about two best friends, and when they're teenagers, one accuses her best friend's father of rape. And it's told from the perspective of the daughter whose father is convicted and sent to prison, and he's going to get out of prison. And it tells the story in this dual timeline between the night, which was this idyllic, beautiful night in a summer, gorgeous summer by a lake, in a lake community between these best friends. So it kind of shows the how hard it is to really come to an understanding of the truth, right? If there is the truth, a single truth. So that was a very personal and difficult story. Whereas This Terrible Beauty, I mean, it's personal too, actually, because the idea came from my father and my father's history. As a German, he was born just outside Berlin. He used to spend summer vacations on this island called Rügen, which is up in the Baltic. I didn't even know there were islands in Germany. Yes, there are, and they're beautiful. So his stories from when I was a teenager, and then when I became a young woman, really took root in my imagination. And so that book is personal too, but in a very different way.
Your story about The Forgotten Hours made me want to ask. It was very popular. It was really loved. Like, all of the reviews, all the reader response has been through the roof. So interesting to me that you struggled, you fought writing that, and then it made such a connection to readers. Have any insight about why that is? Because usually we tell people you got to love what you're writing, and you got to, you were.
No, it wasn't like that for me. I mean, I have to say that finally, when I completed it and sold it and had the final draft, I was very proud of it. I had wrestled that thing to the ground, right? It had taken all of my strength and my energy for years to surmount that obstacle and to write that book. And I did feel at the end, I felt like I wrote the book that I wanted to write. I set out to write this book. It was hell writing it, but I somehow did it. So I felt very proud, actually. Mm-hmm. I felt scared too, because it's a bit controversial, and not everybody's going to relate to it. I get that. It's a difficult story. And you'll see, you can see from the reviews, plenty of people hated it too. It's got a protagonist who's, it's challenging to really hear the story alongside from this perspective. But I felt pretty proud of it once I had finished it. It was, so that might be a little bit, I worked very, very hard on it. And so I think I achieved a certain coherence in the story that is part of why connected to readers.
By the time I was done, I loved it. I love that. But back to this Terrible Beauty, which is historical. It's set in the aftermath of World War II. I get this question all the time because I write about a very popular spot in history, right? The Italian Renaissance. It's well trod. I mean, there's been a ton written about Leonardo da Vinci. There's so much that's been written about World War II and the aftermath. And how did you approach that? With what were you trying to say that you felt like hadn't been said yet? I mean, yours is a lot about, recovering from that. And I haven't seen as much written about that.
Yeah.
What's your feeling?
Well, one thing I felt pretty confident about with this book was that there were not that many books in the English-speaking world that centered on this particular time period. So while I knew that World War II fiction was very popular, I don't consider this to be World War II fiction. I think, it shares some traits. It's definitely in the same genre generally. But I went to the island with my father. I went to Rügen when the wall had just come down. And I sort of saw with my own eyes how these German people had lived in these little fishermen cottages. And it became so real to me that these families had first struggled under fascism, and whether or not they agreed with Hitler, they had to suffer through their country taking them to war and wreaking this unbelievable havoc throughout the world. So they get through the war and they don't know who's coming. Is it the Russians? Is it the English? Is it the French? Unfortunately, half the country, it was the Russians. And I just saw and thought and empathized with those Germans, what that must have been like to have to first suffer through fascism and then through communism. And I also knew that Americans, while they had a basic understanding of Germany being split in two, and everybody's heard of the Berlin Wall, that's famous. Given that I didn't know all that much about the intricacies of the history of East and West Germany, I thought it could be really interesting to American readers to learn a bit about something that seems a little bit familiar, but that they really don't know that much about.
What was the biggest thing that you learned about not just Germany, but about humanity's reaction to that moment and people's just reaction to the splitting of that country and what did you learn? What was the biggest shock, I guess?
I think, in factual terms, one thing that surprised me was that the wall wasn't built until 1961. So I hadn't really realized that there were all these years where East and West Germany were kind of in limbo in a way and trying to figure things out. And that during that time period, many of the East Germans were really hopeful for this new regime. And it was almost a way to redeem themselves after the, apocalypse of fascism, basically. So that was something that I had never looked at from that angle and didn't understand in that way. And then I learned a lot about the secret police. I had heard about the KGB in Russia, and from movies, certain tropes. But I hadn't really understood the psychological kind of warfare that they perpetrated, and how insidious it was, how it kind of crept up on the population. And by the end of East Germany, some astronomical percentage of the population were spying on each other. It was something like 80% of the population were unofficially Mitarbeiter, they were called. They were like spies, basically ratting each other out. So that sort of insidious encroachment of a totalitarian system is something that I hadn't known much about. And unfortunately, I don't think we're beyond that even today. I mean, I think that the power of propaganda, twisting the truth around in order to appear to say what we want to say, all that sort of stuff is still happening in our world. It's just we're not often that aware of it until it's too late.
That's what I was going to ask, is as you were starting to talk about this, I was starting to feel these echoes of what
Yeah,
we're living through today, and these completely different camps
yeah,
in our country,
yeah,
and how divided we are. And I guess
yeah.
I sort of had this hope that somehow this pandemic would heal some of that in some way and bring us together, but I can't tell whether or not that trauma is going to split us apart further, or
Yeah, I don't.
provide some sort of camaraderie and coming together.
Yeah, I don't really know. And of course, when I wrote this book, it was before our political system became so incredibly divided into these very separate camps. I mean, we've always been divided, and every country has factions with different beliefs and so on. But I do believe that we have reached a whole new low, basically, in how deeply divided we are and how difficult it is to bridge that gap. And unfortunately, I don't. I wish I had some answers. I don't know that I do. I mean, I do think that in this terrible beauty, ultimately, love does win. Ultimately, I mean, there is this idea, not necessarily in the storyline, like not everything ends up, hunky dory, perfectly happy, but fundamentally, I think I do have the belief that human beings generally care for one another, and that is our core instinct, and that can be twisted by other people or by circumstances. But I do believe that it's possible for us to be more empathetic and more connected, and hopefully we'll just continue working on bridging that gap so that we can talk about our differences.
I had many other things to talk to you about, but I love that note to end on, that it's hopeful that we can
Mm,
all come back together, that that there is hope at the end of all of this, somehow, somewhere. I'm not sure where it
yeah.
is.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, when I was writing This Terrible Beauty, I wasn't sure because I don't plan very well. And I wasn't sure how the novel was going to end. My main character is on this, she's separated from her child. And the big question is she going to get her child back? And will she ever be reunited with the man that she loves, and so on? And I wasn't really sure. I didn't know yet what was going to happen. And I had to ask myself, am I fundamentally a pessimistic person? Or am I somebody who believes in the power of forgiveness? And I worked it out through my characters. So through my supposed bad guy, Vanna, once I fully realized him as an individual, uh, he kind of told me what the end of the story was going to be. It was sort of based on him and a choice that he makes. Um, is how the end ends up where it is, and I think fundamentally it is something that is rather hopeful.
I love that you figured out, you asked the question of whether you were a pessimist or an optimist ultimately while writing a novel. And I think that that's what good novelists do, right? They don't come to a novel with a preconceived notion of what they're writing about. They come to a novel
Yeah,
with a lot of questions.
yeah.
So I know you're struggling with the next book a little bit. But do you know what questions you're trying to answer yet with your next one?
It's a similar question again. It's going to be about a young woman in the 60s who goes with her professor husband and her family to the island of Ibiza, which you may know is like the rave, clubby island. Well, my grandmother lived there in the 60s and the 70s, and I went to visit her, and I was very impacted by that kind of bohemian culture. And so I'm going to explore feminism and like the individual sense of purpose. And those are kind of the big general themes. It's all going to take place on this island with this slightly dysfunctional protagonist.
Functional protagonists are the best. I love that coming out of the pandemic, you're going to be looking into life's purpose, because I think
Yeah.
we're all going to be doing a little bit of that. So I think
Yeah.
that is an excellent, excellent place to be heading.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Storey.